Okay, I'm going to talk today about climate change and biodiversity loss, these two big issues, and specifically why climate change has got all of the attention and why there's so little attention relatively on biodiversity loss. I'm going to look at some of the factors that have made climate change go mainstream over the past couple of years or so, and have a look also at what the prospects are for this happening for biodiversity as an issue in itself. Okay, back in 1992, the world sat up and listened to what environmentalists had been saying for quite some time. Namely that the planet was heating up and that we were to blame for it, and that we were losing biodiversity at an incredible rate and that we were to blame for that too. And the assembled governments all got their heads together and they came up with a couple of international agreements. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, 16 years later, we're still in an incredible mess. And I think partly it's down to how the communications about these issues has been done. I want to start with a quick survey. Can you put your hands up, please, if you've ever seen a polar bear? Not on TV, not in a zoo, or if you've been to the Arctic. Okay, some lucky people. How about a tiger in the wild? Or been to the Brazilian Amazon? Okay, this is a gathering of people with an interest in the environment, and there's a tiny number of you really that have put your hands up. The communications about these two big issues, climate change and biodiversity loss, have been led for many years by environmental NGOs, and they've been using images like this. They've been talking about places that Aunt Mabel, who we heard about before, has never been, and about creatures she's never seen. So, while focusing on these things is very good at raising awareness about some of these issues, it's very difficult, I think, to translate that into action. And it might work for a niche group of people, such as animal lovers or nature lovers, but not for generating a broad base of response to the challenges. Okay, now, fast forward to 2008, and I think what the last year's conference, which I wasn't at, what people said then was that climate change had gone mainstream. And this chart here shows what people have been searching for on Google over the past few years. And for the first 18 months or so, climate change and biodiversity are almost parallel in terms of the amount of interest, apart from a little spike early in 2004. Whoops. Wow, okay. Can we go back? That's one, thank you. Okay. So in 2004, David King, who was the chief scientific advisor to the UK government, said that climate change was as big a threat as global terrorism. Big spike in attention to climate change. And then it went back down again. Biodiversity and climate change, very similar. And continued in that way until August 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit. Now, you can't associate any individual event, such as a hurricane, with man-made climate change. It's just not scientifically possible. But what this did, by happening in a rich country, was crystallize the issue in the minds of many people. And it happened at a time when scientists were publishing lots of research that was suggesting that climate change would, in fact, lead to a greater number of the stronger hurricanes. And it also actually created space in people's minds for thinking about the many natural disasters that we're used to hearing about from developing countries, and maybe thinking that they are also linked to man-made climate change. From that point onwards, climate change took off and biodiversity got left behind. We had Al Gore coming out with his Inconvenient Truth. We had, late in 2006, the publication of the Stern Review, which was commissioned by the UK government. And the Stern Review was on the economics of climate change, and this found, as you probably know from the media coverage, that the conclusion was that spending money now to prevent climate change would result in a fraction of the expenditure of doing nothing and waiting for the impacts and dealing with them afterwards. Following that, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its latest fourth assessment report, the first in a few years, on the science and on the impacts and on the way of mitigating climate change. Then last year in Bali, at the end of the year, there was the UN Climate Change Summit, which had massive media attention, lots of NGOs there. And then the Nobel Peace Prize was given to Al Gore and the IPCC for their work. Now this is based on what people are searching for on Google. Max Boykoff, who's an academic at Oxford University, has also looked at the increase in coverage of climate change as an issue in the media in the United States and the UK, and it follows a very similar trend. These economic, political, and scientific factors that together are combining to boost its profile. And what they all have in common, really, is that they're human elements. Lots of human interest stories, and I think that's something that has been left behind with biodiversity. It's curious, though. Climate change has a human face now, many human faces, but biodiversity still is all about tigers and jungles, gorillas, pandas, etc. Not so much about people. And this is strange when biodiversity is the source of the clean water. It's the source of insects like bees that pollinate many crops that we eat. We also have traditional medicines that something like 60% of people in developing countries rely on for their health care. And also many sources of modern pharmaceuticals as well, worth tens of billions of dollars. Fish, all sorts of other foods as well, all depend on intact ecosystems and the biodiversity that's within them. There's also recreation and spiritual benefits as well. Lots of people have a very deep connection with nature. I think one of the issues about why biodiversity is less prominent is that something like 50% of the world's population is now urban and very much detached from the wild nature that we see in all of these pictures. It's very difficult for people maybe to even understand that they're part of biodiversity and not just a separate element of the planet. So what are the prospects for a boost in the next couple of years? There are a number of things that are coming out in 2009 and 2010 that could give a bit of a boost to biodiversity in the media and in policymakers' circles and in general public discourse. As we heard earlier on, it's the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin, and David Attenborough's going to be doing a big series on BBC One about this. I think also what I was saying about before with Al Gore and his Inconvenient Truth is we may be in need of a similar kind of massive film, massive media thing that we can look at for biodiversity. There's one prospect is the Earth from the Air team are going to be putting out a film and releasing it free across the internet for people in any country to see. That's one potential. This man, Pavan Sukhdev, is going to become famous in the next year or so. He's doing a big review of the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. He's trying to put a price tag on biodiversity and on the ecosystem services that wild nature provides us, things like clean water and a stable climate. His report will be coming out at the end of this year or in early 2010, and could do much for crystallizing people's thoughts by putting a dollar value on these things. This is the interim report that was released earlier. And then in 2010, as we heard earlier, the Convention on Biological Diversity will have its next big meeting. They've set some big targets. They want to assess the state of progress towards stemming the loss of biodiversity. And we heard earlier from the CBD that national governments will be leading the celebrations, but I don't think there'll actually be much to celebrate. All of the experts conclude that biodiversity loss isn't being stemmed, and much less is even being counted properly. Other targets that they've set for 2010 are to agree a legal regime for sharing the benefits from biodiversity, and that just means making sure that any use of biodiversity involves sharing benefits with the custodians of biodiversity. Climate change as well is going to keep biodiversity on the agenda, and this is a potential way for biodiversity communicators to increase what they're talking about. Not only mitigating climate change by keeping trees upright, but also adapting to climate change using things like biodiversity of crops. A couple of quick slides just to finish off. It could be worse. Back in Rio, when these conventions were agreed, there was also a convention on stopping desertification. That doesn't get a look in at all, so maybe biodiversity advocates should be a bit happy. Somebody mentioned earlier that the term biodiversity itself is a bit of a pain, and maybe it is time to drop the name. People understand wildlife, they understand nature, and they're interested in it, as these search records show. Maybe it's time we move away from using biodiversity. What about the credit crunch? As this chart shows, interest in that is rising, obviously. Does this mean that biodiversity and climate change are going to drop off the agenda? Or does the credit crunch mean that we're going to start thinking a little bit more about how we live, be less materialistic, and give avenues for us to start talking about these environmental issues in a new way? And lastly, whoa, unfortunately, I'll have to go back. Are we just doomed? This slide indicates the terrible situation we're in. Britney Spears hasn't done anything in 2008, and she still records many, many, many times more the searches on Google than any of these issues that we're talking about. But bear in mind that that's largely driven by the media, and this data, of course, largely comes from America. And as we heard earlier about new media, new ways of communicating, maybe we can circumvent the traditional media and talk about these issues in a way that doesn't involve having to rely on The Sun or Mirror or Fox News or whatever else. Thank you.